Now, for this, I went through and my secretary and we got some Bible verses out on the history of dogs, on what the Bible says about dogs. So you might find this quite intriguing and quite challenging. In fact, there are 40 references in the Bibles to dogs which are in the negative. You gain the impression, particularly as reading Jewish history outside the Bible, that dogs were not all that popular, even though here's some of the things you find mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Job, chapter 30, they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I wouldn't have even put with the dogs of my flock. Now, do you realize that Job had some people who'd become his enemies and they were so distasteful? He said, I wouldn't have even let them look after the dogs of my flock or camp with the dogs of my flock. So by Job's day, and in the history of the Bible, Job's one of the oldest books. They were using dogs to work with their sheep. So the shepherds, if you disdain dogs, you disdain shepherds. They were smelly. They lived out in the fields, and that attitude still continues in many countries today. But what's interesting, if you pick up that book of Job, you find in the surrounding chapter, it talks about people, young people who abandon their society and go out and they live in caves. Silly people. This is cavemen arising out of cities that were even existing, civilization that existed in the days of Job. And we go on to read the one book Bible verse that identifies a specific dog in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 29 to 31. It mentions about the lion. Well, that's not a dog. It mentions quite a few creatures, horses, but it talks about greyhounds, being able to outrun them. So this is in the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs, you're around about King David, King Solomon. So we know they were keeping dogs for hunting. So, greyhounds really fast. We use them today for racing. And I still remember the controversy. They would train the dogs by putting a cotton bunny up and training the dog to chase it. That's regarded as socially unacceptable anymore. So they have to find some way to get the dog to get its hormones going for its original training, and that was to chase animals. Okay, then in Genesis, you'll find again what Glenn said, God created them after their own kind. But by the time you get to Genesis chapter 7, Noah is told to take every clean beast, and he's given a certain number, and then there'd be 2 of each unclean. So between creation and Noah's flood, have the dogs gone downhill to the point of killing? Well, we're not sure, but afterwards you find that God tells Noah he is free to eat any creature that moves. Now, this was an important rule because God told Noah he would, take all the animals, 7 of each clean kind. 1 of them would be sacrificed. He would take 2 of each unclean kind. But after the flood, he changes the rules about what he can eat. He no longer has to eat the carrots. Animals that move, carrots don't move. You never have to catch a carrot, right? The dogs do. Now, it's interesting. Not one animal, pigs included, was excluded from Noah's diet. So even if the animals such as dogs had become classified as unclean by then, and it seems to be unlikely, given everything we know about the history of wolves and the origin of wolves with the rest of the dogs, that the wolves and the dogs were still regarded as clean. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 9, God puts a sign in the sky, the rainbow, and he tells Noah, this is a sign to all the creatures. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm pretty sure that the reason I hear the birds chirping when they see a rainbow after the storm is not just that the storm is finished, but somehow they know this is a promise from God. Yes, it's a promise that God will never judge the world again with water, and it's just as big a promise to those who leave one color out and pretend that homosexuality is okay, that there is another judgment coming, but this time by fire. But the animals understand that in some way, shape, or form. So it's interesting as you follow through the history of animals, because by the time we get to Matthew chapter 15, Jesus is talking to a Canaanite lady, and she's actually saying, you could heal me if you wanted to. And Jesus actually quizzes her in her attitude. Let me read you what he replied, or what she replied to him. And she said, "True, Lord, what you said, yet even the dogs, you regard me as dogs. I'm one of these people. I'm not a real Jew. I live up in the mountains there. Even the dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So in her society, the dogs were not just chasing animals, they were not just rounding up cattle, they were not just sheepdog anymore, they'd moved into the house. Now, there's quite a few cultures that still won't let the dogs in the house. I'm glad Glenn's American culture, my English culture, Scottish culture has dogs that enjoy being in the house. Oh, yes, you certainly have to be careful about where they poop. Oh, and by the way, those people who want to know, do dogs go to heaven? Perhaps you should ponder, since fleas love dogs, would the dogs take their fleas to heaven? I never get asked that question. By the time you get to um, one statement we read in Proverbs, it reminds you of your responsibility. Not only did God give us authority over the animals, it says a righteous man regards the life of his beasts. So you want dogs, you want seahorses, then you are responsible to God for their care. I say that seriously because what happens at Christmas time? The pet shelves, etc., get raided for animals. They're given as Christmas presents. 3 months later, the people, the parents, and the kids decide, I can't bother cleaning up. I don't want to have to feed this. This guy wheezes everywhere. No, sorry. A righteous person in God's sight is not just one who's saved, is someone who cares for the animals that are under his control. Now, perhaps we should finish off with just this verse. It's out of Philippians. It says here, when Paul writes to the church at Philippi, which he seriously loved, right? This is the one church that never gets chastised. He says, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. Now, the issue in the early church, of course, one of the issues was a lot of the Jews had become Christians. They come from a background of very legalistic, under the law. They're now redeemed by grace through faith, and that not of themselves. And yet there are workers coming in saying, oh, listen, the word says you need to be circumcised. And Paul says, don't fall for it, guys. You were not saved by circumcision, even under the law. You got into Israel, but you never got into heaven by being circumcised. You need a circumcision of your hearts. You are saved by grace. But notice the insult, notice the term, beware of dogs. Now, I heard one pastor get up and say that means homosexuals. Well, I've got no doubt about that. There are some cultures where that is how it would be read. That does mean homosexuals. I mean, sniffing around the backsides of other men. That's how they would view it. But in this context, it refers to anybody who disobeys God. Anybody, whether it's Jewish, whether it's legalistic, whether it's a Christian who wants you to not do pin bowling or whatever because it's happening in a hotel. No, sorry, that's got nothing to do with the game itself. What you're looking at is people who want to have more laws than God does, at the same time as you're looking at people who want to have less laws than God does. Can I encourage you as we finish our study today? Remember, God gave us his word. It starts in Genesis, it finishes in Revelation, and you are saved by grace through his faith that he gives to you. It's a gift. So if you don't have it, ask. He freely gives to those who will ask. You can't be saved by what you do, even to your pets, but you can only be saved by Jesus Christ, who was crucified on a cross, whose blood was shed for you. Now, that may not be your way to be saved, but in reality, it's the only way you can be saved in God's eyes. Oh, and then, by the way, make sure you listen to what he says about your animals and caring for them on this planet, because you will be held accountable for what you do to his property. The dogs are not your property. The seahorses are not your property. They belong to him, and he will hold you accountable for how you care for them and treat for them.